What I'd like to do is give you a perspective of what led up to 9/11 from a person that worked in the field, in the trenches. And, but first, before I get into that, I'd like to just say that I will always be held in shock and awe when I hear people that work in this field say that 9/11 was a totally unpredictable situation. And I say that for three reasons. One, as was briefly discussed earlier today, the aviation field has always been the favorite target of terrorism going back to the 1960s for a number of reasons, which I won't get into. The second is the intelligence information was so great that something was going to happen. And I acknowledge the fact that we didn't know when or where, but something was going to happen, something in the near future. And Commissioner Romer went into that in a little more detail earlier today. But I would also like to, excuse me, read a statement from the former Associate Administrator of FAA Security on April 6th of 2000. Thank you. It says, this was to the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation Subcommittee on Aviation Security, and I quote, moreover, members of foreign terrorist groups and representatives from state sponsors of terrorism are present in the United States. There is evidence that a few foreign terrorist groups have well-established capability and infrastructures here. When you combine that with what the Commissioner said earlier, that's a pretty strong indication that something is brewing. The third thing is we proved in the red team that FAA did not even enforce its own minimum standards of aviation security. And when you combined all three of those, to me that's pretty much like adding 2 + 2 and getting 4, that maybe we ought to do something to beef up security. And as another example in my written statement to you, I received a document in the course of my whistleblower complaint that was written by an FAA agent in Boston Logan Airport. And this was written on May 18th of 1999, in which the agent became so frustrated working through the system, the FAA system, that the person went to the Inspector General's office and described a very serious problem at Boston Logan Airport, which, as you recall, is where 2 airplanes left from. And I quote, as a result of this situation, Logan International Airport is in a critical state of non-compliance with federal aviation security regulations. And this went to the Inspector General's office, and no action was taken by the IG's office as early as 1999 to correct the problems there. But to give you my own background, I first started working for FAA in the latter part of the 80s, and it was a direct result of the murder of Robert Stetham, who was a Navy sailor that was killed on TWA 847. And I was recruited, or when I was recruited, I was told that FAA is looking for appropriate people with military and law enforcement background to start fighting this war on terrorism. So there was absolutely no doubt that our mission was to fight terrorism as it applied to the aviation industry. A little time went by, and then we had Pan Am 103, and in the presidential commission that investigated that afterwards, they interviewed an FAA field agent who did some work in Frankfurt, which of course is where the bomb was placed on the plane. And this was an inspection the person did several months prior to the bombing. And the agent said, if I recall right, that the only thing that's holding security together at this airport are the tenuous threads of luck. And nothing substantially has changed in FAA's attitude about security since before the Pan Am 103 bombing. One of the high points, however, that occurred as a result of Pan Am 103 was the appointment of General Orlo Steele, a retired Marine Corps general who was appointed, I believe, in 1990 to take over security. And he did try to change the culture and was in fact changing the culture in FAA security, but he had only a very limited tour of duty, 2 or 3 years. And he was in a position he was forced to resign at that point. And I recall being at headquarters at the time. I was actually a team leader in the Federal Air Marshal branch when he resigned. And the very next day that he resigned, FAA rescinded a lot of his orders and directions as far as how we conduct business. And I knew it from that point we were going back to business as usual. I then quit the Air Marshal branch because it was outright dangerous, some of the things they were proposing that we do as far as changing our rules of engagement and training and whatnot. And in 1995, I became a team leader in the Red Team. And it took me about 2 years, between 1 and 2 years, to realize that there's a very serious problem in how FAA conducts its business. And the reason it took me that long is we would test virtually every aspect of security, from the screening checkpoints to access control, caps. We didn't have caps at that point, but it was profiling. Later we did test caps, screening of checked baggage, and some other areas, cargo security. And we found major loopholes in every area of security that FAA was involved in. But after 2 years, I started trying to work within the system, and I knew that was a pointless effort because criticism is not accepted in FAA. That's part of the culture. And I became so frustrated that I joined up with another Red Team, or former Red Team leader, who also found problems similar to what I had. And the two of us, and his name is Steve Elson, just for the record, we started going to the Inspector General's office to try to get them to do something about this sorry state of aviation security. And they did nothing. And I talked to a senior official in the IG's office, and he actually explained to me that when Mary Schiavo was the Inspector General of the IG, she had a very aggressive stance against FAA, and it caused a lot of political problems. After she resigned, the IG had a kinder, gentler approach to dealing with problems with FAA. At a later meeting, he actually informed me that unless I give him a dead body and a smoking gun, there's nothing he can do against FAA management. Well, I submit now he has close to 3,000 dead bodies and a gun the size of a cannon, and they still have not taken any action against anyone in FAA for the poor manner in which they executed security. Anyway, life went on, and we continued doing testing around the country and around the world. And I've probably been around 30 or so countries around the world looking at their security systems and how our aviation industry was impacted by that. But still, there was no improvement in security. And we then went to the General Accounting Office and tried to get them to do something about aviation security. And I was not aware of it at the time. I learned of it since then. But the GAO has their own long history of reports going back 20 years documenting how poor aviation security is. And somewhere during that time frame, we were also joined by Bob Manetti, whose son died on Pan Am 103. He joined us on some of these meetings to GAO and some other offices. So after that, realizing I wasn't getting anywhere, I sent a letter to Administrator Garvey in August of 1998, trying to explain to her that there's a serious culture of gross mismanagement in civil aviation security. And she didn't even have the courtesy to respond to my letter, much less take any action on it. I did send a copy of the letter at the same time to the Secretary of Transportation, Rodney Slater, and he at least had the courtesy to respond to my letter, and he advised Jane Garvey to look into some of my issues. But there was never any follow-up, and nothing ever occurred as a result of that. More time went on, and while I was actually doing my testing, what I found out over the years is that the Red Team was basically working its way out of a job. Whenever we found major problems in security, such as a screening checkpoint, we did some massive testing in 1998, I think it was, lasting almost a year, where we came up with horrendous results on the screening checkpoint. And after that project was over, we were prohibited from testing a screening checkpoint anywhere since 1998. We also did testing overseas in their explosive detection systems, and we found major problems with those, and FAA prevented us from going back and retesting to try to find what those problems were and to correct those problems. More time went on, and I don't have time to go into all of it, but basically we were working our way out of a job. Every time we found a major problem in security, we were beyond the normal problems. We were restricted from doing testing. And by the time of 9/11, about the only type of testing we were doing was explosive detection systems domestically. But we also did some international testing, but not a whole lot. And on the day of September 11th, I was working in the operations center of FAA, and I forget who brought it up, but someone brought up the issue of a gun being on one of the flights. And what happened that day, we received information from a credible source at the operations center that a gun was in fact used on one of the flights. And around 4 o'clock that afternoon, Ms. Garvey asked for an executive summary for everything we knew up to that point in time. And if I remember right, it was just a one-page document, just a summary. And we reported the gun on American Airlines Flight 11. There was also some issue of a possible explosive on another aircraft. And when this went on, I didn't give it a second thought at the time, because I figured if you are going to hijack a plane, why not bring a gun? And I knew from working in the red team that it was fairly easy to do, so I didn't give it a second thought. And two or three months went by when the press resurfaced that issue, and FAA's immediate response was that there was no such document. Then apparently they were confronted with the actual document, and then FAA's response, and this is written in the press, was that we admit that there is a document, there is an error, but there is an error in it. And they actually stated that what the person meant to write was, it wasn't a gun, but it was a knife, and instead of a bullet wound, it was a stab wound. And it just that kind of activity going on this entire time, where they just denied, and in my opinion, tried to cover up what actually went on. And I don't want to take up too much time, but that is the gist of the history of how we got to 9/11.